Eric, good to see you. Thanks for taking a bit of time out to come and have a chat. Really appreciate that. Just to kick this conversation off, let's start with the mission.
Mm,
Tell us what you're trying to achieve.
great. Yeah, thanks, Paul, for the opportunity. It's great to be here on your show. In terms of Randamu, what we're trying to accomplish is we're trying to bring to market some really new cutting edge technology that we think is going to have a tremendous positive influence on people's daily lives in a couple of different dimensions. The first is with regard to security. We believe that the threshold cryptography that we're bringing to market has the opportunity to really increase the security posture of folks that are transacting on the internet, predominantly in the Web3 space, but also in Web2 and some more traditional transactions. And in addition to bringing that security, it also brings with it some elements of verifiability, which allow us to verify that transactions actually did occur in the way that we think they occurred. And so that also verifiability has applicability to what we think is truthful. And so it allows us to make evaluations about whether or not we think things really happened the way we think they happened, which we think is even more important in today's age of AI,
Yeah.
where so many people are bombarded by information from different sources. In many cases, they can't always attest to the veracity of those sources. And so we believe that the need for this kind of technology is going to continue to grow.
Yeah, it's a really important point that you just made there. This whole idea about what is the truth. It's
Mhm.
actually really important, isn't it? I know people think about it in terms of politics and fake news and all the rest of it, but actually, it's really important to be able to differentiate. So it's a very, very well made point. And when was the moment when you thought this could have global impact? Just tell us
Uh,
about that moment.
that's a great question. I think I stumbled into the topic of randomness as a mathematical topic,
Right.
and mathematical randomness is a very niche topic that typically only mathematicians and computer scientists tend to debate about. But I was actually reading a book by James Bridle, a British scientist, called Ways of Being. And in it, he has a very large chapter on randomness and its role in our lives. And so most of us don't think about randomness, but it actually has a huge influence on a wide variety of processes, both in life and in computer science. And so being able to harness this randomness in a manner that allows us to attest to the truth or falsehood of things, for example, was a very fascinating idea to me. And then as we move into this, kind of brave new world where we have lots of macroeconomic change and we talk about climate change and all the various different challenges that we face as a global society, it seemed to me that, randomness and truth and security and privacy all had, key roles to play in ensuring that we can advance our global civilization in a positive direction. And so it was an opportunity for me to make a very small contribution to a much larger set of goals around digital human rights and what we think about as our autonomy as human beings and being able to make intelligent decisions based on actual data rather than just feeling an innuendo, for example. And because that is lacking in so many aspects of our lives, this gave me a chance to make a small contribution to improving that.
Sure. And when you realized that you know what you're developing could have an impact globally. What were you able really at the beginning to see the kind of crux of the problem that you were going to have to overcome to achieve that? Just tell us about that.
Yeah, it wasn't immediately obvious. In fact, it only came to us in waves, and most of the insights that I and my team have uncovered have really come to us from talking to customers and partners and other
Yeah.
people who are wrestling with similar problems. So I can't say that we that the strategy was fully formed in our minds prior to engaging with the real world. It was only through our engagement that we were able to uncover some of these different areas where we could make an impact. And so I think we've noticed a distinct shift in terms of how people communicate with potential customers and partners, and it's shifting more towards in-person meetings, which seems kind of odd and ironic in our age of,
Yeah.
such
Yeah. Yeah.
computer science, advances. And here we are having a conversation over a remote telecommunications link. And yet, the value of in-person connection has only risen because as people become more disassociated from one another and disintermediated by technology, I think they place a much greater emphasis now than they once did on in-person meetings. And it was through these in-person meetings with customers and partners and other like-minded individuals in our development community that we were able to come to some of these conclusions. And it was only by really sitting down and breaking bread with folks and spending some quality time with them that we were able to analyze some of our assumptions and figure out how we could take this technology that we had and bring it to market in a way that was truly disruptive and impactful.
Mm. And just give us an indication of the sorts of customers that you're talking about. I mean, what sort of people would buy
Yeah,
this
for sure.
technology?
So when we first got our start, the only service that we were offering at the very beginning was publicly verifiable randomness through a network called DRAND, which is the short for the distributed randomness. It was the server that basically runs these random number beacons, is what they're called. And so it emits a random number every 3 seconds, and it's offered as a public good because randomness is included in so many different computational processes. So people can just harness that at will. And so in many cases, we didn't know who our customers were because they
Yeah.
weren't required to divulge their information to us as part of this process. But we discovered some because they reached out to us and they said, "Hey, we really love your service. It's really super helpful to us. And in fact, we're using it in these new and innovative ways." And so one of my a fun example is a company called Proof of Play, which is actually a gaming studio. They're making a game called Pirate Nation. And in their game, there's a variety of different random events that occur. For example, you can actually be doing battle with one of the adversaries, and the results of that battle are determined randomly. You can be creating a craft for your character to actually navigate through the world, and what sort of options you have available to you are generated randomly. When you move throughout the world itself is regenerated every 48 hours through randomness. And so they were using our randomness to basically inform the creation of their metaverse,
Right.
where all their players came together to have fun and create community and basically play the game. And so that was something that we hadn't anticipated because we weren't realizing that this randomness would be so crucial to, in this case, the creation of a video game,
Mm.
and the creation of a community behind that game, which now numbers in the hundreds of thousands. And so that was kind of an exciting and unusual discovery, and something that we uncovered. Something that's maybe more meaningful and close to home is we discovered that we were being used by a philanthropy called Social Income. And Social Income is a philanthropy based in Switzerland that offers universal basic income to impoverished families in Sierra Leone.
Right.
And as you might imagine, there are more impoverished families in the world than there are money, in this case, from one philanthropy to be able to offer. So they had to come up with a way of offering this money in a fair and impartial way that didn't demonstrate any bias or any favorability towards one family over another. So they used our random number generator to create a sortition process. And sortition, for those who may not know, is the process of basically drawing lots and randomly selecting from among a cohort of possible selections. And so, by using our DRAND randomness to basically power their sortition process,
Mm.
they were not only able to choose these recipients in an unbiased way, but they were also able to publish these results publicly in a publicly verifiable manner, so that others from the community could come in and prove mathematically that these were done in a fair and impartial manner and not actually influenced, say, by politics or by birthright or whatever other means that somebody might lay claim to some of these funds. And so that was, on one end of the spectrum, we have a video game, which, seems like a trivial and almost leisurely pursuit. On the other end of the spectrum, we have this very fundamental assignment of income to people who need to feed themselves, right? And so, and everywhere along that spectrum, you can imagine there are many different applications of randomness that come into play, which is why we named the company Randamu, because it's a sort of an homage to randomness and how it informs our daily lives.
Yeah, and it's a very good illustration of how the randomness issue pops up in all sorts of different areas when you start to think about it, doesn't it? I mean, so you realize that your technology could have a global impact. I mean, there's a lot of challenges involved. It seems to me, well, tell me I'm wrong, but
Yes.
it seems to me
Yeah.
there's an awful lot of challenges involved in going from where you started to where you've got to now. I mean, how do you feel about the role of the CEO in that context? I mean, people tell me it's a bit of a roller coaster. They have good days.
Yeah, yeah, it's
I
very
mean, tell
chaotic.
us about that.
You're absolutely correct. I think in the past we tend to think of CEOs as being very directive and very almost
Yeah,
egocentric
yeah,
and having a very clear and crisp vision for where they're going and heading steadfastly into the future with a clear-eyed view of things. And in my experience, we got our start in the open source community, and so we began with a community of like-minded, very egalitarian people who are accustomed to evaluating one another on principles of contribution and how, what prove to me what you can bring to the table, what you can bring to the party, so to speak, before I entrust you with, further responsibilities. And so, as a CEO in that environment, I believe that I think of myself as kind of a servant leader rather than the traditional sort of canonical CEO who is very egocentric and has a strong and um, unvacillating or unchanging vision, you might say. Because typically, in order to harness this chaos, in order to harness this randomness in service of a greater goal, it's really important to meet others kind of where they are at, assess what they can contribute to the effort, what they're willing to contribute, what they're able to contribute, and then try to harness that in a way that aligns with the contributions of others. And so it's much more of a player coach kind of a role
okay.
than the more traditional, Fortune 500 CEO type of a role. I find it much more to be servant leadership, where I first ask, how can I help you before I ask you to help me in any particular way, whether that's a direct employee of the firm or whether that's one of our many partners who contribute to the broader ecosystem. And so I think by taking that more humble approach, we've been able to accomplish a great deal more than we otherwise would on our own recognizances, right? We're a very small team. We only have 7 individuals, including myself, on the team. So it's a remarkably small group. Some would say it wouldn't even rise to the size of a fully formed team in most large organizations. And yet, one of the reasons we're able to accomplish the outcomes that we accomplish is because we are so well supported by such a large and diverse community that we've been able to tap into and sort of tie our wagon to, you might say,
Yeah.
in order to converge on a common set of goals that most of us share.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like a quite a different way of doing things. It also sounds to me to be more to be more problematic than simply being able to kind of direct people. There's a lot more negotiation,
Yes.
conversation, dialogue, and all the rest of it. I mean, which means you need to be pretty motivated to stick at it. I mean, what is it that motivates?
Well, I think one of the interesting things that I've discovered in the open source community that I think differs from the traditional corporate milieu is the people who are participants in that community are there for very deeply held personal reasons,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They are not motivated necessarily by glory or fame or even money. Many of them are motivated based on some deeply held principle that they have, like a strong commitment to digital human rights, or perhaps there was a very formative experience in their past that led them to become impassioned in this particular area. And so that's how they typically contribute. And so I've found it to be kind of refreshing in the sense that, there's an old saying in corporate America, you want missionaries, not mercenaries, right? You want people who are out there proselytizing on behalf of your company or firm rather than people who are simply paid to fight, you might say, as you would think of a mercenary. And so open source is full of missionaries, right? Because these are people who are motivated by deeply held personal convictions and are not motivated necessarily by the typical extrinsic rewards that we think of in a traditional sort of commercial environment, right? That's not to say that you can't also earn some of those commercial rewards, but it is a very different community than what you would encounter in a typical Fortune 500 style of corporation.
Mm. Uh, I mean, and were there things that really kind of, I mean, when you look back on the journey, were there any particular things that really tested you as as the CEO?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. Some of the things that I find most difficult are actually, in some ways, the most mundane, right? Like just communication, for example, is a constant struggle. Many of the team members operate from different time zones. I happen to be the only person on the team that's based in North America. Most of the team is spread throughout Europe. And we have partners all over the world. We have partners in every corner of the globe, in China, throughout North and South America, all over Europe, even in Africa and other remote places. We've talked to people in New Zealand and elsewhere. So just the simple things like what time is it in my colleague's time zone? Can we get on the phone together and have a conversation? He or she might be waking up first thing in the morning, just getting their coffee or tea, whereas the other person's been working all day and is in a different sort of mindset because they've been at work for 8 hours already. So just being able to overcome those kind of natural human dissonances has been an ongoing struggle. And one of the ways that we've tried to address that particular difficulty is by meeting in person on a fairly regular basis. And so we try to get together a minimum of once a quarter,
Right.
sometimes more frequently. And that sort of the budget that we have for travel takes place of the budget that you would normally allocate for an office building, for example. So in a traditional company, you think of bringing everyone together in the same physical space and you pay rent for an office, or maybe you happen to own an office building. In this new paradigm, in this new way of organizing, everybody works from home because it's a lot less expensive to do that. But in order to get everyone together on a periodic basis, you have to, in some cases, fly people halfway around the world.
Yeah.
And we use conventions and other conferences as a forcing function because it allows us not
Okay.
only to get together as a team, but also meet with prospective customers and partners and others in our community. And so that has been a very fundamental delta from, say, a more traditional Fortune 500 style of employment. In my previous life, I used to work at places like Microsoft and Google, and they of course had big corporate events as well, but those events typically were not very frequent, and not everybody got to go to them. So it was typically mostly just salespersons that got to go to those events. And so in this new realm of working in Web3 and open source, we go to these events almost because we have to,
Yeah.
not because we're particularly trying to sell a specific product or service or we're trying to reach a certain audience. It's really a forcing function to keep us together as a team.
Yeah. And of those things, I mean, were there things that really surprised you? That you thought,
Yeah.
well, I didn't realize I'd have to do that or deal with. I mean, just tell us
Yeah.
some of those things.
Well, I think one of the surprises is when you're working in an environment where people are so personally motivated, your ability to align everyone's efforts is no longer about enforcing a common vision on everyone. It's really about harnessing their differences and pointing those differences in a similar direction. And I'll give you a concrete example. We have two people on our team who are very talented software developers. One of them develops software in a particular language, let's call it language A, and another one develops software in a different language called language B. And oftentimes, both of these have strongly held opinions about the superiority or the preferability of
Hmm.
their language over other languages. And so it would seem like a mundane sort of thing where in a normal corporate setting, you might say, oh, we're going to use language A, and that's just the decision that management has made, and therefore we're going to go do that, right? And because we're talking about open source and different modules working together with one another, we've had to say, oh, okay, developer one, you go build in language A, developer two, you go build in language B. And it's incumbent upon both of you to find a way for these two modules to work together and talk to each other. And they end up being much happier and much more motivated by that than, say, a corporate diktat that comes down and says, you must code in this particular way or this particular language. And so that was kind of surprising because I would have expected, in a more corporate setting that everybody would sort of converge on what is the best tool to address this problem. Do I need a hammer or a screwdriver, depending on what kind of work I'm trying to do? But because there are so many different ways to do things in software engineering, and there's no one right way in most
Mm,
cases,
mm.
um, finding that middle ground and finding places where people could continue to work together and be highly motivated and highly productive and still doing their own thing, it's more like a jazz ensemble and less like an orchestra, you might say, where we have to find ways for people to riff off of one another
Mm.
rather than me as the conductor trying to say, now it's time for strings, or now it's time for the horns to come into play. This is a much more dynamic and
Yeah.
sort of less structured environment. And so I'd say that was a big surprise, figuring out how to move forward together in such an environment was intrinsically challenging.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly sounds challenging from this. I mean, listening to you describe it. I mean, on that note, though, I mean, obviously, I mean, this issue about keeping people motivated, and also if you're in an environment where things are changing, I mean, being able to stay agile,
Yeah.
given the kind of complexity of the relationships involved. I mean, how do you manage that? Because that can't be easy.
No, I think the way that we've found that seems to work for us, and that also sort of reinforces the culture, is kind of doing a demo, setting a demo day on the calendar, or sort of a show and tell day. So
Okay.
what we'll do for our development team is we'll get together, we'll decide on what we're going to work on for the next sprint, and these sprints can vary in length anywhere from 1 week to as many as 5 to 6 weeks in a given sprint, depending on what we're working on and the nature of the work that needs to be done. And then basically we say, okay, at the end of this sprint, each developer has to demo their code. They have to do a show and tell for everyone else on the team to prove what they've done. And surprisingly, or maybe not, maybe unsurprisingly, depending on your view of human nature, people really rally to that because
Yeah.
it accomplishes two things. One is it sets a very concrete sort of time boundary for them in which they have to have all of their work completed and ready to show. And it also gives them a sense of pride of ownership
Yeah.
over the work that they're
Yeah.
doing. So I find that the risk of embarrassment in front of your peers is a much stronger motivator than saying, "Hey, we got to get this done by this date, or we're going to lose money, or the customer's not going to pay us, or something like that." Right? Like people feel like those are sort of extrinsic motivators, right? And they're less excited by that. But if I tell one of my talented engineers, "Hey, you've got 3 weeks, and then you got to show me something, and what actually happens here," they find that incredibly motivating and incredibly rewarding. And so as a result, they double down and they really become very productive and very focused. And then all of a sudden, when everybody kind of comes up for oxygen at the end of the sprint, and we're showing each other what we did, it becomes not just a checkpoint, but also sort of a celebration of what was accomplished.
Yeah.
And in some cases, they don't always accomplish what they set out to do. And they're like, oh my gosh, I thought this was going to take me 2 weeks, and it turned out to be a much thornier problem than I expected. And here's why. And so, even in those circumstances where we experience ostensibly a failure, it's an opportunity for learning and growth and kind of a furtherance of our mission.
Mm.
And so, that using these demo days as a forcing function has really enabled us to come together as a team, even though we have many disparate things going on at any given time.
Yeah, yeah, and the thing it was good as you were talking. The thing that was going through my mind was how good that must make people feel when they're able to show how much progress they've made.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if you just completed a difficult piece of work, regardless of
Yeah,
what the nature of the work was, right? Whether it's software or building something
yeah,
physical or virtual. It's an opportunity to showcase your skill and your talent and your competence. And I think I find that software developers really embrace that. They believe in their own competence, they believe in their capabilities, and when you give them a chance to shine and kind of take center stage, you will say not in a necessarily a social setting or a business setting, but among peers. I think that's when they really rise to the occasion.
yeah. One of the things you touched on was the fact that people are in lots of different jurisdictions, lots of different parts of the world. I mean, when you look back on the way your business has developed,
Hmm.
has it evolved as you've brought on board more more parts of the world? I mean, or is it,
Absolutely. Yeah,
you
absolutely.
tell us about
It's
that?
been interesting to see how that unfolded. The business got its start in a European research institute. And so I would say in the early days, it had a very strong European flavor to it.
Right.
And it was populated by people from continental Europe. And so a lot of that culture permeated the work culture and sort of the expectations and the working hours and that sort of thing. As the network grew to incorporate sites in North America, that also brought a different flavor with it, a different set of expectations, sort of a different way in which we approached all of our production capabilities and how we were rolling out updates and changes. And then Asia was for me the biggest surprise because even though I had had experience working in Asia before, I was literally quite taken aback by just how rapidly they would adopt whatever
Mm.
we had published and sort of begin to push the edge of the envelope. In fact, one of our Asian partners went so far as to rewrite our code base in another language. Originally, the code base was written in the Go language for the DRAN server, and this partner of ours took it upon themselves without any remuneration to rewrite the entire code base in another language so that they would have a different version of the software that they could run.
Wow. Wow.
And so that was very unexpected and very, shockingly surprising, but in a sort of revelatory way, right? I would not have expected
Yeah.
that from anybody in
It's
any
impressive,
particular.
actually. That's pretty.
Yeah, so I think it speaks to their ambition and sort of their desire to really get involved. And it turned out to be a wonderful thing for us.
Yeah, I mean that's a really positive example. But there must also have been lots of differences that were more challenging to kind of resolve. Um,
Mhm.
how did you do that as you grew? And I mean, my interpretation is that it's getting more and more complex by the day. I mean, how do you
Yes.
manage that?
That's a great question. I think what we typically would do is it's pretty evident when you're on a small team, you can see pretty
Mm.
quickly where the areas of need are and where people are dropping the ball, where things are getting left behind or not being taken care of in the manner in which we'd like to take care of them. And so as a small startup, our sort of agreement, our verbal agreement amongst my co-founders and I was that we were basically gonna try to wait until the pain became unbearable before addressing it through hiring or
Okay.
through choosing a way forward. And so we literally go through a weekly exercise where we have sort of a red, yellow, green dashboard of items that we review, and many of the items on the dashboard are red. And so we're like, okay, is this painful enough that we need to spend money on fixing this, or is this painful enough that someone else on the team should drop what they're doing and go address this?
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, then we leave it red, right? But eventually it gets red, then it becomes white hot, and then eventually people are like, oh my gosh, I can't make any more progress in what I'm doing until this other dependency is taken care of. And that's usually when we will pull the trigger and we will then
Yeah.
hire a partner or hire a service provider, or in some cases, directly hire an employee to address that gap,
And that's
right?
so different to kind of conventional thinking where you try and head off those things rather than
Yeah, yeah, I would
allowing the
say
pressure to build, isn't it? It's a very different approach.
that's a great point. I think when I think back on my corporate experience, people are basically paid to avoid risk. And
Yeah.
so if
Yeah.
you're in a large successful corporation that's already making money, your job is to not screw anything up, right? Your job is to not break anything. And so if you can demonstrate to your management that you did a great job avoiding risk and avoiding the disruption of anything, then you're in good hands, right? You're in good stead. I think in being in a small startup, it's almost inverted. The only way that the startup will be successful as a business entity is if it embraces a risk that no one else has taken on and finds a way to subjugate that risk. And so we are constantly wrestling with risks of different kinds, both, existentially as a small company, but also within the scope of our products and services. And so being able to prioritize, sort of which risk is the greatest and which risk is most in need of correction, is sort of the key to being able to surf through these risks and into the future and hopefully to a successful outcome for customers and for investors.
And it's also a very interesting way of prioritizing because it helps you really get a sense of what you must do and what you're not going to do, which is often
Yeah,
a
yeah.
challenge that people struggle with.
Well, I think the biggest struggle in my experience has been people's sense of ambiguity. I think in a corporate setting, when you have a very structured commercial environment, you're used to things being sort of reliable and dependable and repeatable. And in a startup environment, you're constantly beset with different every day is a different day. Every set of challenges is a different set of challenges. And so people who do not find a way to thrive and be their best selves in an environment of very high ambiguity are going to suffer, right? They're just going to hate it. And I've actually seen this happen with individuals where they come from a corporate setting, they're used to the trains running on time, so to speak. And then they get into a startup setting and now they're left to their own devices. And it's much more, at the risk of using a military analogy, it's like guerrilla warfare, right? Like you're
Yeah,
constantly
yeah.
trying to attack a problem and then hiding and then running around somewhere else and finding another way to approach the situation. And so you have to be sort of always on your toes, always dealing with a large set of unknowns, much larger set of unknowns than known things. And so I often find myself telling people on the team, "Hey, let's not worry about X. Let's focus on what you can control. What can you control today? What can you do today that's going to help move us collectively
Which
forward?"
is actually a very empowering thing, isn't it? To focus on
Yeah, yeah,
what
it
you
is.
can do
It's about
something
setting
about.
boundaries, right? I think a lot of people, when
Yeah,
they see all of this chaos and all of this lack of predictability, they sometimes freeze. They're sometimes like, "Oh, I'm afraid to do anything because I'm afraid I might mess something up." And that, of course, is the wrong thing to do, right? It's
yeah,
it's been said companies are like sharks; they have to keep swimming or they'll
yeah,
drown because
yeah.
that's the only way they can breathe, right? And so that's doubly true for startups, right? You have to keep moving forward. And so anytime someone on my team says, we have to wait for that, or we don't want to do that, or we're not going to do anything, that's always a red flag, right? Because it's like you have to, even though you don't have all the answers that you would like to have, you still need to keep moving. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you're going to be dead meat pretty soon, right? So,
It's
um,
and it's interesting how you describe life in a startup as kind of like guerrilla warfare. I mean, I can totally see that. I mean, one of the things that was going through my mind as you were speaking there is as you grow and get bigger, I mean, maintaining that culture
yep.
is going to get harder. Have you thought about how you're going to be able to deal with that as you grow and expand over time?
Yeah, the 100%. One of the things that was a big unlock for us is that when we started early on, there were only, right now we're 7 people. When we first started, there were just 3 of us. And as we added one or two more people when we were in let's say the middle stage of our current growth trajectory, um, we had a set of processes by which we were constantly checking in on each other, and we were constantly saying, "Oh, hey Paul, what did you do today? Oh, I did that. Hey
Yeah.
Eric, what did you work on today? I did that, right?" And it very quickly became too much overhead, too much administrivia, right? And so we started basically entrusting one another with certain things, with certain responsibilities. And we said, "Okay, Paul, you're responsible for, cleaning the kitchen, let's say, for example. And so I'm not even going to step foot in the kitchen. I'm going to stay in the living room over here and watch TV, and that's my job, right? Metaphorically speaking." And so being able to trust one another and kind of let go of that need to always be in the know about what was happening was very liberating because it allowed each of us to focus on those things that we are best at.
Yeah.
And then instead of always bringing updates to one another on an ongoing basis, we would update one another less frequently, but with results. We would say, "Hey, these are the results I delivered this week," or "These are the results I delivered this month," or whatever the time horizon or the project happened to be. And so that way, and then the others could make an assessment. They could say, "Well, that's great. We're ahead of schedule," or "That's not good enough. What kind of help do you need? Why didn't you ask for help sooner? How can we stop what we're doing and go help you so we can fix this problem?" Right? Like those kinds of brainstorming sessions became much more
Yeah. I
constructive.
mean, it's very interesting you describe it that way. I mean, one of the things I've always thought is this, if you can't trust people, why would you employ them? But
Indeed.
so often you see organizations that employ people and then spend their entire lives checking
Yeah.
up, and you think, well, there's got to be something that's not right there. But so it's very
Yes.
interesting you describe it that way because well, if you do trust people, you can then make much more progress, can't you?
Yeah, indeed,
Let
indeed.
me just pick up something I mean, when you look back on that journey, would you say there's anything in particular that you learnt about um, that has perhaps changed you as a CEO? Have you evolved as the business has evolved, if you like?
For sure. I would say there's two aspects that I pay much closer attention to now than I used to. One is I want to, and this is more difficult the bigger you get, obviously, but I want to make an attempt to get to know this person as a person
Mm.
before getting into actually hiring them as a full-time employee.
Yeah.
And I think one of the mechanisms by which we sometimes do that is we can hire people on a contract basis as kind of a temp to perm, right? So we can say, hey, you come on board for 90 days, we're going to pay you X dollars. And, at the end of 90 days, we'll make an assessment. And if we agree that this is a good fit, then we'll keep going. And if we don't think it's a good fit, we'll
Mm.
part ways, no harm, no foul kind of thing. And that's been tremendously helpful because it's helped, you can interview somebody to death, as many large
Yeah.
companies do, and still not know how that person will perform under certain circumstances, right? And so you do the best to de-risk the hiring process, but at the end of the day, it's only, when again, to use a Marshall analogy, when you're together in a foxhole, that you really see how somebody behaves.
Yeah.
And so I think that's been a big
Those
differentiator.
things take time, don't they? They
Yeah,
take
they
time.
do take time, and a lot of times it seems ironic, but many corporate folks feel pressure to produce results, and therefore they don't always give things the adequate amount of time needed in order to accomplish their ultimate goal. And so that's a little contradict, it seems like ironic in a way.
Mm.
And then the other thing I would say is have a very clear and crisp vision of what you actually want this person to be responsible for and what kind of results you expect them to produce. And I think some people mistakenly attribute that to, well, I have to make a more detailed job description, right? And so you end up with these like 3-page job descriptions where employers try to put everything but the kitchen sink in there. And I find that those are counterproductive,
Yeah.
right? I think that at the end of the day, someone should have a very clear, crisp mandate. And because you can't anticipate all of the different problems that may arise over the course of a given person's career or engagement with the company. And so instead of trying to imagine every corner case and write that into the job description, you should simply have a very clear, very concise understanding of what role that person plays and what results that person is expected to generate for the company.
Which comes back to the trust thing, doesn't it, Paul?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And so you look at companies like Netflix, for example, which is sort of infamous for its culture, very hard charging culture, but also very empowering, right? Like they don't sit there and babysit one another. They just look at the results at the end of the quarter or the end of the month, and they say, "Yep, you're doing good," or "Nope, this is subpar, you're out," right? Like it's a little bit mercenary in that sense, but it's also very clear, right? Like there's no confusion or obfuscation about what's going on, because
Yeah.
people are very clear about why they're hiring in, what they're expected to accomplish, and what constitutes success or failure, right?
And ultimately, people choose whether they want to work in those environments or not.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely not an environment for everyone. In fact, it's probably not an environment for people over the long arc of their career, but doing a stint at a place like that, particularly earlier in one's career,
Yeah.
I think
Sharpens you up, I think, would be my.
yeah, yeah, I think it can be very useful. And it's something I encourage some of my younger proteges to do is to find a job like that. Not to make it their life's calling, but just to be able to expose themselves to that kind of environment to see what it's like because it's very educational.
Yeah, and I mean, being stretched is good for you at the start of your career, no doubt about
Yeah,
it.
I think
Let
most
me,
people when they're early in the career don't know what they're capable of, and then
yeah,
later in the career they sometimes overestimate or underestimate what they're capable
yeah,
of. So it's good to be put in that sort of situation.
yeah. And when you look back, what are the achievements that you're most proud of so far? I mean, I know you've got
Um,
a bit to go,
yeah,
but
I think
what are you most
you know,
proud of?
I think one of the biggest achievements that we're very proud of is assembling the network of partners we've been able to assemble. I was chatting with somebody earlier about how the League of Entropy got its start and how it only started with 5 organizations, and that even in that brief beginning, those organizations had to trust one another a great deal in order to come together to form this kind of confederation of node operators who were going to be running this service together. And even that process was very difficult and fraught with difficulty and not always trusting one another and that sort of thing. And since that time, that small group of 5 has now grown to 25,
Well,
and it's gone from being a small group of people reaching out to other peers in the industry saying, "Would you consider joining our little confederation here?" To now the opposite is true. We get regular requests inbound saying, "Hey, I've heard about what you're doing. It sounds amazing. We'd love to be a part of it," right? And so that's the kind of but it was slow going. I mean, that's taken it'll be our 6th anniversary here this summer. And so it's taken some time to put that together, but the result has been really quite profound and quite surprising in a positive way.
yeah,
And so we've attracted some of the biggest names in the infrastructure industry, like Cloudflare, for example, is one of our cornerstone members, and they operate the largest content development network in the world. And
yeah.
we were able to attract the attention and interest of the Ethereum Foundation, which again is
Wow,
a
wow.
very fundamental kind of organization. And we also have Kudelski Security, which is a big security purveyor of security software and solutions based in Switzerland. And so we have all kinds of really amazing institutions that have since joined. A lot of universities and research organizations, which I'm particularly proud of, because we're trying to push the edge of the envelope in terms of how this security research gets applied in the real world to solving actual practical problems. And having these associations as members is just a validation of our approach, in my opinion.
And
It really speaks
as
to
you're
what we're.
describing that, I mean, the thing that strikes me is that the focus on kind of trust internally is
Mhm.
kind of, being extended because you're building trust-based relationships with other partners. So it kind of
Indeed.
extends, doesn't it? Really, which is quite it
Yeah, we're trying. I mean,
illustrates
the
how
whole
important it is.
Exactly so. And the whole premise of a lot of Web3 technology is really to this kind of sounds a little wrong, but to dilute trust. In other words, we're trying to create systems that function even in the absence of trust.
Yeah, yeah,
But in order to accomplish that, we need to start by bootstrapping with trusted organizations.
yeah.
But we don't trust these organizations with everything. We still hold them at arm's length, which is why I refer to it as a federated approach, right? Because we're working together in one sense in that we're all operating nodes on a shared network, but we're also holding one another accountable and holding one another at arm's length in another sense, in that everyone has to prove to everyone else that they are operating at the appropriate standard and with the appropriate security guarantees.
Powerful discipline, I would say. A very
Yeah, yeah, I
powerful
think
discipline.
so. And it yields a lot of benefits to the people who eventually come in and avail themselves of the network, because then they're able to harness that for their own benefit.
Yeah. And is there anything that you, as it were, know now that you wish you'd known at the beginning?
Wow, that's a good question. I could probably come up with a laundry list of things I wish I knew that I discovered
Anything in
later.
particular?
Yeah, I think getting, just building human consensus. It's ironic because
Mhm.
our systems are used primarily for building agentic and machine-based consensus. And so that's what we're actually building is a system of consensus. However, getting a bunch of human beings together to agree on something continues to be a gargantuan struggle. And I,
Yeah,
and I think
yeah,
that it speaks to, the nature of the human condition, that it is as difficult as it is. And so in some ways, it's ironic that we start to hand off some of these decisions to machines, because it's literally easier for us to get those machines to agree than it is to get
yeah.
the human
That is
beings.
such an irony, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think When you think about AI and agentic intelligence and where the world is going these days with some of these latest and greatest innovations, um, there are some decision types that I for one will be very happy to hand over to machines
Yeah,
because it seems like the risk to us as humans is very low and the benefits of arriving at
yeah,
consensus are very high. And
yeah,
so therefore we should those decisions we should let machines make. But there are other types of decisions that I think we as humans are uniquely equipped and capable of making. But man, getting people to agree is just really, really tough. And I
yeah.
think
You've only got to look at politics, haven't you?
yeah, I was going to
See
say
that.
you can
See
see the
that.
results of that in our political discourse today, right? Things have become
Yeah.
much more polarized and much more difficult in many ways. And so as a result, I think that's some people like to see patterns where none exist, and so they have sort of conspiracy theory approach to all this. I think it's much more simple than that. I think that it's just it's a reflection of the denigration of these consensus mechanisms among us as a human society here on planet Earth, right? Like we just
Yeah.
continue to get it wrong and continue to miss one another.
Although
And
I
so,
suppose we don't want to get onto the subject of Donald Trump, or we'll be here forever.
no, no.
No.
Yeah, let's avoid politics entirely if we can, for sure. But
Yeah.
I think that what interests me, sort of a meta point that I will make about our political discourse, is that I think it's a reflection of how the role of politics has changed in people's lives, right? If you think about it, if you think back 30 years ago, 50 years ago, we lived in a world that felt a lot more certain and a lot more well understood. And I think as we hurtle headlong into the future, we're approaching this sort of inflection point in history where the amount of innovation and the amount of change that takes place in the world is eclipsing our ability as human beings to really process it all.
Mm.
And because of that, I think that our reliance upon and our trust in some of the institutions that we've created over the last 100 years has eroded. And that erosion is felt in the fact that they have less and less of an influence on our lives today, right? I can't tell you how many people I've met that are from all different corners of the earth. And literally, when they want a change of scenery, they just get up and they take all of their assets and all of their belongings and they jump on a plane and they go somewhere else.
Mm.
And so the role that city states have played in our evolution as a human society is really diminishing because I think people can just now go wherever they want to go. Well, not everyone can, but
A lot
an
of people
increasingly
can.
large number of people now have that capability. And I think some of them are voting with their feet and saying, look no further than Lisbon, Portugal in your backyard, right? It's the number one destination of
Yeah.
people who want to leave the United States and go live overseas. They've got this golden visa program. And so now countries are competing with one another to
Yeah.
attract people into their orbits, you might say. And to me, that's quite novel because if you'd asked me 30 years ago, would I want to move to Portugal or would I want to move to any other country? I would have said, that's crazy talk. I'm quite happy where I am. And today it's relatively easy for people to accomplish that.
Yeah.
At least in the West, it is.
Yeah. Another
Uh,
example of how the world's changing, really.
exactly.
Let me just ask you a couple more things before we wind up. I mean,
Yeah.
if is there any particular? I mean, imagine somebody was just starting out. Is there any particular advice you'd give them?
Yes. In fact, I'm glad you asked me that question because I just had a niece graduate from college, and
Right.
she was asking me a similar question, and I said, really, there's two pieces of advice that I would give my 21-year-old self if I could go back in time. Number one is um, take on the maximum amount of risk you can possibly tolerate at this young age. Because when you've graduated from college and you're just starting out, you have the least amount of commitments you will ever have for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah.
And so therefore, it's an ideal time to go out to see the world and to take risks and to gamble on things that might seem ill-advised, but then you'll only get one shot at them in your life, and it's best to do that as early as possible. And so that's why we here in the US we lionize entrepreneurs who
Mm.
dropped out of college and started their own billion-dollar business and became unicorns because that is the time in your life when you can afford to take
Yeah.
on the most risk.
Yeah.
And so that's number one. Number two is go to a place somewhere on the planet Earth where you are surrounded by a cosmopolitan group of people who will challenge you. to be your best and stretch you into in dimensions that might be uncomfortable and you might not like to be stretched in. So, here in the U.S., I sometimes tell friends and family, hey, go to New York City, go to Los Angeles, go to some large cosmopolitan area or go to San Francisco, right? Go to the Bay Area. These are all places that are highly cosmopolitan. They have a global community from all over the world, and they're very hard charging and high performance environments. And so these are the kind of places where I think young people should test their mettle.
Yeah.
But the same could be said of London or Paris or other places within Europe as well, or Asia for that matter. Singapore comes to mind, Beijing,
Yeah. Yeah.
Shanghai, Hong Kong. These are all places where people will get stretched. And so if I had known what I know now when I was 21, I would have done that more deliberately. I accidentally fell into some of that, but not to the same extent that I would if I knew what I know now.
Of course, it's more possible now than it ever has been to do that, isn't it?
Exactly right. Yeah. When I graduated from college, I basically had to work all summer just to save enough money for a plane ticket to go overseas. And today, that's much more attainable for a lot of kids, right? So it's much less of a chore. I had to spend a year planning for what I was going to do before I actually did it.
Mm.
And for many kids these days, that's no longer an obstacle, right? It's much easier to
Sure.
to just
Yeah.
hop on a plane or a train or whatever and go to another part of the world quickly and easily.
Yeah. Yeah. And Eric, you've talked about a lot of stuff. Let me ask you one final question. Do you think there are any? I mean, you're in a very emerging industry. I mean, it's a very new world, Web3, isn't it? Do you have any big predictions about the way that's going to change things in the future? I mean, just give us your thoughts on that as a final thing.
I do. Thanks for the question. I think that even the terminology we use when we refer to it as Web 2 and Web 3 is an indication of how these two worlds have sort of emerged side by side, but not yet combined. We don't think of them as being part of the same whole yet, and so I believe that will, in the very near future, that distinction should disappear very rapidly. And I believe the way that's going to happen is by Web3 finally breaching this delta between these two worlds and coming up with an outstanding application that the average user will want to benefit
Right.
from. I
Right.
think the reason why Web 2 and Web 3 are so distinct of one another today is because Web 3 has an inordinately high bar of technological requirement of the user before the user can actually engage in anything Web 3 related. And that hurdle needs to be addressed, and that hurdle needs to be dispensed with. No one asks themselves whether an Apple iPhone is Web 2 or Web 3. They don't even think of it in the context of the web. They just think of it as an appliance that
Yeah.
brings them convenience and that they can use on a daily basis. And the same should be true of a lot of the Web 3 technologies that we're developing today. But unfortunately, it's not, and that's partly because no one in the Web3 space that I'm aware of has done a particularly excellent job of eliminating this hurdle for the average user. And I think when that finally does occur, we will see sort of a natural flow between these two
Yeah.
dichotomies, these two sort of different environments, such that people will just ordinarily begin availing themselves of Web3 capabilities and technologies. And so it might come in the form of an app that shows up in the Apple App Store, for example, or it may come in the form of a new cell phone model and make and model, or it could come in the form of a new banking transaction sort of paradigm that banks broadly adopt. These would all be different ways that it might enter into our shared consciousness. But for now, because it is so challenging and technologically difficult to actually make some of these things happen on a day-to-day basis, it remains in the realm of hackers and specialists and people who have a penchant for these ideas about security and privacy and are willing to put up with a very high degree of friction in order to bring that into their lives. And I think once we remove that friction, these two terms will eventually become meaningless, and we'll no longer refer to things as Web 2 and Web 3. We'll just refer to it as the web or the internet, and we'll go on with our lives and
Yeah.
not think of this as being two dichotomous and different things.
Yeah, yeah, but very exciting. I mean, when that happens, that will really change how a lot of things are done, isn't it? So it'll be really
Yeah.
exciting to see that happen.
We're very hopeful that that's the case. In fact, that's why we've committed ourselves to the cause of digital human rights and some of the processes and things that we've built out, because we do think that it's important for people to have security and privacy and
Yeah,
all of the typical things that we would expect as members of a civilized society.
yeah, absolutely. Eric, thanks for because I know you're super busy. I mean, I really appreciate you taking time out to talk us through what you're doing and to share that story. I mean, it's fantastic, and as you've just said, could lead to some really significant changes to the way we do things and changes for the better, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's what
So,
we're working towards. We certainly hope that's the case.
yeah.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's been great chatting with you and to be of service to your audience, and look forward to many more great episodes to come.
Likewise, good to see you, Eric. See you soon. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye bye.